Welcome back to the Cheap Heat Productions podcast. Okay, welcome back to the show. And today I've got a special guest. It's Miss Michelle Belanger. How are you doing, Michelle?
Doing pretty good. How about you?
Doing great. So you are an author, an occult researcher, a TV personality, a singer, and a lot of other things in between.
I keep myself busy.
Yeah. How did you fall into this world of? We'll start with the kind of paranormal side of things.
Mm. Well, I was born into a family where psychic stuff was pretty normal. They
Yeah.
were first or second generation Irish American, and carried a lot of like fairy stories and like stories of like the Black Coach, that sort of stuff. I was also born with a heart defect. So for the first 5 years of my life, I was in and out of hospitals. My life expectancy was 5. That's when they were able to do like
Wow.
life life-saving surgery. So there were a lot of brushes with death. There were a lot of conversations about death, and what comes after. Among people who definitely believed in survival after death, who believed in ghosts, who had their own experiences, and a family that really not only were believers, but they encouraged research. They encouraged like learning as much as you can about things. And I was a really early reader. So all of that pretty much like converged to help make me, where I'm very much a scholar and an academic, but also an experiencer. And I kind of tread that line between a believer who is immersed in the experience, but also someone who can step back, and really enjoys analyzing it, from sociological, anthropological, and psychological standpoints.
Yeah. Do you remember kind of what your first experience was in the paranormal kind of sense?
The one that I remember most clearly was at the local library. It was before my final heart surgery, so it was probably in the neighborhood of 4 years old. They
Okay.
were renovating an old residential home to become the local library. And I didn't know it at the time, but multiple people were having experiences as they were renovating this house. Uh, I ducked underneath some caution tape where I was absolutely not supposed to be. So the instant my mom told me I couldn't go there, when her back was turned, that's where I went.
Yeah.
And I, climbed up the stairs, and I was expecting it to be interesting since I wasn't supposed to be there, and it wasn't. It was just, a hallway, couple of doors. One of the doors was open a crack, so I poked my head in. And this too was disappointing to 4-year-old me. It was an empty room, or at least a mostly empty room. Like there was some painting stuff over in a corner, and there was a woman standing at the window. And she caught my eye, because she had this amazing dress. I remember it with such clarity because it had all these tiny little buttons up the back to a tight collar, and these poofy sleeves, and tiny little buttons down, like the sleeves on the thing.
Mm.
And to me it looked white with like little blue embroidered flowers. And I was like, how does she button all those buttons? Like, oh my God, I'm still working on how to tie my shoes. She doesn't say anything. I know in retrospect that she is an intelligent haunting because she turns and acknowledges me. There's eye contact.
Yeah.
If I'd had the language for it, I would say that she was melancholy. She was just looking out the window, kind of sad and wistful. She never said anything, but she was definitely a presence. And at the time, that was a person. Like I had no sense that this wasn't a person in the room. My mom eventually missed me and called up from downstairs, and I had that like sudden guilty flush that you get when you're caught doing something you're not supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
So I ducked out the door and yelled down the hall that I was coming. And In the time that it took me to turn and duck out into the hall to yell, and I turned back, the woman was just gone. No, there was no other door, no other anything. I was standing in the one door of the room. 4-year-old logic, I was like, oh, she's not supposed to be in this room either. And she found a hiding place. So I didn't think much of anything of it beyond just I saw this cool person and she had a neat dress. It was years later where I heard enough stories about the local library and the lady in white that people would see, that I discovered I had seen her at a time when she was consistently seen looking out that specific window.
That's crazy. And when did you tell your parents or whatever about that experience, or
Hmm.
did you just keep it to yourself?
I'm not sure when I ended up talking about that specific experience with my mom. I
Yeah,
shared a lot of experiences with my mom, and she was, incredibly open-minded and supportive of things. She was an artist and a violinist, a little bit of a wild child. She was a
yeah,
hippie, and so she was just intrigued by some of the things that I would talk about, and wouldn't lead me on so much as would just like make space for me to share it and then ask questions about the experience in a way that I found both very supportive, and helpful to, I didn't have shame about these experiences, and I didn't uh, doubt them in a way that I felt was self-sabotaging, but I did question, why did I have it, what was going on, and a lot of that comes down to my mom.
yeah. And from a research perspective, obviously you study this thing now in great detail. When did that cycle begin for you?
Oh, I, like I said, was an early reader, partly because, open heart surgery. I didn't go out a lot. I might have been a really active kid otherwise, but I couldn't. And I was one of those kids where I fought for the right to read Edgar Allan Poe in second grade. Like if it was weird and quirky and spooky, I just dove in
Yeah,
head. Fiction, nonfiction, the spookier the better. And I loved the nonfiction stuff, like the collections of ghost stories and learning about Borley Rectory and the spiritualist movement. So I'm like 10 years old in school giving book reports on stuff like this when everybody else is talking about like Clifford the Big Red Dog. So I
yeah,
was very much a weird kid, exuberantly so.
yeah.
And the research was always a big part of it. I've always loved hearing what other people's experiences were, what we thought those experiences meant, and sort of culturally and psychologically, how we could explain why people had these experiences.
Hmm. Did researching and reading all those books at that age help you academically then in school as well?
Mm. Yeah, I was pretty. I was an egghead, not gonna lie. National Merit Scholar, which is kind of a big deal in the States for high school, top of the class, yada yada. I was that kid that like I didn't know how to like socialize with other kids, but I was very at home with books,
Hmm.
and very much like dug into stuff like that because it was a comfortable place for me. And scholarship is still a very comfortable place for me.
Yeah. Was there ever a moment that you experienced something that was kind of unnerving or even scary to a point?
Oh, I mean, several things were kind of beyond the pale and made me go, what exactly was that? Like, what does that mean? Uh, I will say, probably one of the most personally impactful experiences I had was when I was working on Paranormal State. We were at the stage where, for my readings, they wouldn't tell me where I was going, and I would go in blindfolded. That
Right.
was my preference, remains my preference, because it means that there's much less likelihood that I'm going to be unconsciously reading the environment from just a physical standpoint. Like there's so many cues when you walk into a house that it's really hard to rule those out. So with the blindfold, I'm not accidentally like seeing a picture of somebody hanging on the wall and then like inserting that. So it's as
Yeah.
scientific as you can make this sort of field work, which with the acknowledgement that you can't ever truly make it like it's not a laboratory. It was a house in Mason, Ohio. Um, I did not know at the time, but we had been contacted by a woman who lived there with her kids several weeks before, actually several months before. And she'd tried to contact us desperately several times. And it was a time in the TV show where getting back to people was not always very speedy.
Yeah.
And she had hung herself in her garage out of just what she was going through. So I don't know that what I'm walking into is the location of a suicide. Um, of someone who was around my age, who lived and grew up in an area fairly close to where I did. And I think this is the thing that stood out. You go to haunted places and it's, somebody who lived maybe 100 years ago, 300 years ago, depending on where you're at. And you can identify them clearly as not you, not someone you know. Like there's this gulf of experience. When blindfolded, I walked into the space where she had ended her life and sort of stepped into the resonating echo of that experience with all the thoughts and emotions and things stained into the space. It was incredibly difficult to maintain that essential barrier for someone who does psychic work of me versus the perception. It was really easy to have her emotions and her desperation and her suffering overwhelm me, to the point where long after the reading, long after taking the blindfold off, I was at the hotel later that night. And this is not an instance where I think the ghost followed me back. This wasn't an
Yeah.
attachment so much as just it was so hard to extricate how I felt from like the resonant sympathy with how she felt, that I was up at 4 a.m. just trying to find like a way to wall this experience off in my head, because it was something I carried with me and struggled with for several weeks.
Was it because it was fresher and it was kind of a recent thing as well?
I think it was a combination of that. It was how, I mean, 3 weeks, like literally three
Yeah.
weeks prior to this. So it was fresh and it was raw. I didn't know it at the time. Her sister, who found her, I think, was watching me do the reading. There were some details for why she chose to do what she did, that weren't exactly related to the haunting. They were related to some complicated family things.
Yeah.
Um, and some things came out of my mouth, and I guess the sister afterwards pulled me aside and was like, only you know, like you're the only other person who knows that this happened to her. um, so these were like deep secrets. They also did not make it to the episode because turns out you can be psychic enough that you actually infringe on people's privacy rights. uh,
Data protection.
yeah, no, it was a lot. And yeah, the recentness, the rawness, the extremity of the emotion, like all of these things. Like a lot of people ask me, like, are you scared of like, ghosts or demons or, inhuman spirits? And I'm like, honestly, it's been human things that have had the biggest impact on me.
Hmm. And do you think, for example, you were saying that that woman that unfortunately passed away 3 weeks before that. Do you think there's an element of, we'll talk about like energy in a room. Does it dissolve over time?
It can. And I mean, everybody's had that experience where people were fighting in a room. They're not fighting in the room. They're not even in the room anymore. You walk in, you can feel something, like there's a
Yeah.
heaviness. There's something that we react to consciously or otherwise. And a lot of what I think that we call psychic experience is just being conscious and aware of how we react to those things in our environments. They do wear out over time, and yet there are unknown variables that we can look at demonstrably from different locations, like haunted battlefields, where something in the land or the intensity of the emotion or whatever other factor, some things linger far, far longer than you would expect. I know that there are stories of, Romans that are still like walking on roads, and you will get like the echo of their the whole troop. The field at Marathon in Greece is a famously haunted battlefield, and
Mm.
you can still hear and see some of the echo of that conflict centuries later.
Yeah.
So How long does it take? I don't know.
I've never seen a ghost or claim to have seen or anything like that, but there was two instances when I was younger that people that I knew passed away, and before I was told that they'd passed away, I kind of had this kind of uncomfortable kind of shivering on the back of my neck on both occasions, which I thought about afterwards was related to that because it did happen in sequence with those two people passing away. But I think I was only maybe 10 or 11 then, and nothing of the sort has happened to me since. Do you think that that's something that can be related to that, or do you think I'm just
Mm.
overthinking things?
No, I think honestly, most people are sensitive and just either are so, I mean, the physical world is very distracting. Like we have so many experiences of the world around us constantly that we part of our brain's job is to ignore extra
Yeah,
information that doesn't make sense. So when you're in a room with fluorescent lights buzzing, generally your brain acknowledges that. It's not like you don't hear it, you just tune it out. So I think a lot of these experiences that people have, like yourself, will more often get tuned out because they either feel to some part of your brain irrelevant, not easily explained, like there's nothing pressing in the moment, like it's not like a car is barreling down on you. That's far more important to pay attention to than a
yeah.
little creeping sense of something at a distance.
Hmm.
Uh, and yeah, a lot
But
of psychic development is just taking a few minutes to examine like the layers of perception that are coming through all the time.
yeah, it's strange because since then I often thought about that, but then as I got older, people that were closer to me had passed away, and I didn't kind of experience anything like that. So I don't know.
Well, and like I said, there's variables that govern this stuff, or at least influence how and why it is stronger at sometimes that
Mm,
I don't know that we have any way currently to measure or predict. So sometimes someone you've never even met weirdly will get through, and your absolute closest family member that you would expect to have an experience from, you don't.
mhm.
And some of those variables, I think, are internal psychology. If we're too emotionally invested, if we're too tied up with things ourselves, we may miss or even block out experiences. But I think some of the variables are also environmental.
Yeah. I want to talk about one of your books, the Psychic Vampire
Mm.
Codex, and if you want to explain to people what that is and your beliefs in vampires.
Okay, so vampires, it's sort of where I got my start on any kind of stuff with TV. So psychic vampires are not Dracula coming out of coffins.
Hmm.
It's a fairly old concept, more clearly expressed in 19th century occultism. Uh, Bram Stoker, your countryman, was aware of this
Yep.
phenomena. Uh, it's the belief that living human beings have both an ability to sense as well as an ability, if not a need, to take vital energy, like kind of life force from people around them. As somebody who does psychic work, I believe that this is the energy we're talking about when we like pick up readings from locations, the stuff that carries those emotions and resonant hauntings. And as I was going through my journey of like, hey, I'm psychic, learned pretty early on that there was a vampiric quality to my abilities. And that was a bigger struggle than anything else for me to figure out, like, A, that this was a real thing, that it wasn't just, make believe in my head, that there were other people that experienced it, that there were quite a lot of writing about it. And so a psychic vampire, also that they are not universally terrible people. Folks who are unconscious about it are exactly the sort of psychic self-defense manuals are written for, who don't necessarily know that they're preying on people around them, but still do it,
Hmm.
and do it effectively in a way that can be really unpleasant. But if you are conscious about it, it's just one more way of interfacing with energy. You can do it consensually with people. So in fine, a psychic vampire is a person who needs to regularly and actively take human vital energy to maintain their well-being in some format. And there's a whole community of folks who identify that way. And you kind of can't take the psychic out of the vampire in this. It's a type of psychic ability.
And what's the difference between being a psychic vampire and, say, just a normal kind of paranormal
Mm.
researcher will say?
I Probably the biggest difference, aside from identifying as like the word vampire, which is a very
Yeah.
charming word, a lot of
Yeah.
baggage. But unfortunately, it was the best word we've got for it. We don't have a better word in English for someone who feeds off of life.
Yeah.
Uh, the other folks that I know who are psychic vampires who work in the paranormal, some open, some not, have an edge for sensing the energies left behind by people in locations, and also have an edge for harnessing and clearing energy. It's probably the biggest uh, utility to which I've spirits and residual hauntings are all energy. Someone who has my particular skill set can walk into a room that has a lot of, yucky negative stuff, and I might not want to eat it myself, so to speak, but I can grab it and move it around and clear it out of the space. So usually after we do investigations, if there are places that are particularly unpleasant where people are having very, very negative experiences, one of my jobs is to go through and, wrestle the bad things out. And I wouldn't be as good at that if I were not also a psychic vampire.
And how challenging can that be to kind of
Uh,
clear something
mm,
out?
when it's like a residual thing, it's not actually attached to a sentient entity. It's fairly simple. It can be like taxing in a sense that to interact with that energy, at the very least, you get some of the emotion and whatever stuff is kind of seeped into it. So, like the flavor of it. If it's a place where terrible trauma has happened again and again and again, you take some of that in, like you feel some of it, and there's a challenge in learning how to process that or to shunt it away in a way that it doesn't overwhelm you. It's a little trickier when you're dealing with sentient entities. Spirits are just energy too, so you can fight them, go toe to toe with them, wrestle them if you really want to. I prefer first having a conversation. Not assuming that every sentient being is adversarial, even if it seems scary. And part of that is from the perspective of, I call myself a psychic vampire. People hear vampire and they automatically assume someone who is evil and predatory.
Mhm.
So I have a keen sense that appearances aren't always what someone or something really is. So first, I try to talk. Um, Sometimes I'll try to bargain and be like, hey, people live here. Maybe you could settle down, see if there's a kind of compromise that can be struck. And every once in a while, just like people, spirits are assholes. They need to
Yeah.
be responded to as such.
Yeah. And can you take the spirits? Say if I had a spirit here that I called you up and I said, listen, I've got something here. I need you to get rid of it. Could I be guaranteed that you would get rid of it or calm it down?
I will never guarantee something like that for a couple of reasons. The most tricky one that I've ever run into is there's usually some sort of connection that's happened between a spirit in a location and a person who's experiencing the haunting. And sometimes that requires some resolving on the part of the person who's had the experience. If they are if they've been traumatized by their experience with the spirit, you can kick it out of the house. But if that person starts to like kind of connect back to it through fear, through their memories, like it's sort of like leaving a breadcrumb trail. So
Yeah.
uh, I I had a wolf spider in my house a couple of weeks ago, which I very kindly, pulled up into a cup and I put out in my yard. And then about 3 days later, the same wolf spider was in the same spot. And the third time, eventually, I had to just squish the wolf spider because he was clearly not getting the sense that he needed to not be in my house. And some spirits are like that. They just will keep coming back, although you can remove them for a period of time. There
Mhm.
are methods that are, I think, as kind of nuclear options, and I really do prefer to avoid them when possible. Binding is one of the ones that is more long-term effective, although problematic, where the idea behind this, and it leans into folk traditions and witchcraft, where you bind the spirit into an object, into a jar, in some fashion, so that it is trapped in something and stuck in that. You basically give it a little prison, and I think of it as giving them a timeout and sending them somewhere.
Hmm.
The problem that I have found with something like that is nothing is forever. Any of the work that you might put into that to bind something eventually will erode, like that energy will go away and it will come out. And whatever it is will certainly remember you, even if you don't remember it. So you may have a bigger problem on your hand at the end. Uh, there are a lot of mediums who like this idea of opening a door and sending things into the light. And I've got a lot of issues with that. Not the least of which is a door to where and how. Like, it seems a little presumptuous to say that you have the ability to do that, but also, more than do you have the ability to open some sort of trans-dimensional gate and shove a spirit through, do you have the right to do that?
Or
Uh,
is it a religious aspect in that as well? Yeah.
there is a religious aspect. There is a level of judgment, even if some people, I don't think of it that way. Like, they think
Mm.
of sending something into the light as like helping it ascend. But especially a lot of the human spirits, and not even all the human spirits that I've interacted with, they're there for a reason, and sometimes they're working through something, and it doesn't feel like my place to rush them in that.
Yeah.
Which is why I really prefer and see myself in the role of a mediator between the living and the dead. Someone who can start a conversation, maybe strike a compromise, maybe reason with something. Um, but I don't feel at any point, simply because something is a spirit, that any of its rights as a sovereign entity are taken away.
Mm. I was listening to you recently on another podcast, and you were talking about the significance of dreams in
Mm.
people's lives. Do you want to talk to people about that?
I do a lot of dream and dream work. It's a fun place where my psych background and uh, paranormal stuff intersect. Uh, Dreams, historically, for thousands of years, have been seen as a kind of liminal space where we can connect and communicate with spirits and, otherworldly entities. They're obviously places where our brains sometimes just tell us stories as well. So learning how to navigate the difference is pretty important. But there's just the most extraordinary undiscovered country is right here, and we carry it around with us. And one of the key ways of accessing its hinterlands is through dreams and dreaming. Lucid dreaming is a pretty useful skill to try to cultivate. And if you're among the many people who don't ever really remember your dreams, one of the first ways to start to try to do that is, one, ensure that you're actually getting restful sleep.
Hmm.
Certain sleep disorders will impede your ability to drop into REM sleep, which is where your brain does a whole bunch of really important stuff with memory dumps and resetting its chemical balance. And if you're getting good sleep and you're still not remembering your dreams, just the very act of starting to pay attention, like thinking about them, waking yourself up and trying to write down and record even the tiniest snippets, just the feels, with the knowledge that not everybody dreams in images. Not everybody dreams in anything more than like this sort of aphantasic sense of, I was dreaming, and that's
Yeah.
okay.
I've had a few occasions where now it hasn't been anything crazy. It might be like I'd be in a shop at a certain place at a certain time, and I'd be like, this has already happened in my mind. Like, and I kind of associated with a dream. Now it's always
Mm,
just little things like being in a shop or like being in a certain place at a certain time. But in my head, when I'm there, I'm thinking this already happened. This exact moment has already happened. Have you ever heard anything like that?
yeah, frequently. And some of the
Yeah.
most like we think of premonition dreams as like big sweeping, you know, you dream that something's going to
I
blow
just
up,
win the
or
lotto or win the lotto
yeah,
or something like that. Yeah.
the most consistent ones are incredibly mundane, which if you think about it, that's what your mind is most interested in anyway. What's going to happen tomorrow? You know,
Hmm.
what are you going to get to like call off of work early? Like what are you most invested in? That's where your mind is going to unconsciously put most of its energy. Or just driving home, take this turn and not that turn because, you know, there's going to be someone who runs a red light over there. And they are such tiny, you know, in the grand scheme of things, but very significant on a personal level.
Yeah. We're going to talk about your haunted B&B because I think it's fascinating. I've got a little picture here from one of the rooms. And
Oh yeah, I love this.
the thing that struck me here was the dolls in the corner. You have to have
Mm.
dolls in a haunted house. Do you want to explain to me about the Airbnb and what it is that you do?
So we were looking for a place where I could run some of my classes, both on dreaming and dream work, on psychic development and mediumship. Places where we could do like kind of a weekend retreat. This was, of course, before COVID.
Yeah.
And you know, I was thinking like it would be a bonus if it was haunted, but it's not like you can really like get that on a market listing. So, well, in some places you actually have to declare it, but not in Ohio. Um,
Okay.
so we found a couple of places. We walked into this one, and I immediately was like, "Oh, I like the feel here." So I let my wife go deal with the realtor people, and I kind of did an unofficial walkthrough. And you know, at that moment, I'm like, at the very least, this has residual haunting stuff. Like it's old, it's got history. Like I love the look of it, and also I could really help people learn how to tap into their abilities because there's stuff to work with here.
Yeah.
So that was 2018. Um, Ran some really awesome classes. Like it's a lovely, cozy place. It is really haunted. Not in a scary way. Like that was something that I was really aiming for. I wanted a haunting that was active, but not
Positive.
threatening. Yeah, something that people could have an experience, but not feel that something terrible was going to follow them home. So they could, in a comfortable, safe space, sort of stretch those abilities and test their perceptions. It is physically active in a way that is atypical for a place that doesn't have a lot of trauma. Like usually doors open and close and you hear big stompy footsteps or things go flying across rooms, and that's associated with a place with a lot of emotion tied up into it, usually negative emotion.
Yeah.
Not sure what perfect storm is with this place, but you know, about 6 people that we know of have died in the house, but not through any kind of terrible means, just old age. There are people
Yeah.
who just like lived their whole lives there, loved the house too much to leave, and they have opinions. They are very present. They like to play with the music boxes, and the dolls are just honestly a personal thing. If I would go thrifting and I would see a doll that seemed like it was a little haunted, I really don't like the idea of like some poor 6-year-old ending up with something that seems like it's sort of screaming from the inside of its porcelain face. So I'll just like pick up the
Yeah.
haunted doll and, you know, rehome it. My wife hates them.
I'm a big fan of dolls, as you can see from my Chucky t-shirt.
Well, I think they're fun because some of them are legitimately haunted, but a lot of them end up being vessels for our projected expectations. And there's a lesson there as well because we, the perceivers, can sometimes manifest phenomena consciously or unconsciously. And you know, it's a key thing with haunting investigation to realize that no haunting exists purely separate from the humans who are experiencing it.
Yeah. Do people book into your place on Airbnb and not know it's kind of a haunted thing, or do you just advertise it as just a normal house, but it's haunted from your website kind of thing, or what way does it work?
So at first we had it up on Airbnb as sort of like an in between running classes because I write and do so much other stuff. Like the classes were like very far and few between. So just, you know, have it as an Airbnb. It's in a college town. That made sense. And it is active enough that we had a couple of people who were just there because it was like, you know, student teacher week. And they would very
Yeah.
politely send us Airbnb messages and be like, so this music box though, or the one person who was there for some sort of music thing, and she was there for a whole week, and she fell asleep on the couch downstairs with the windows open, and it was late fall, so it got colder than expected, and she woke up with all of the windows shut and a blanket tucked around her. And she was the only person in the house. Now, she was very,
Wow.
very relaxed about this. She was like, "So, I don't know if you believe in ghosts, but I think your house is haunted." At which point we were like, all right, we got to just put this on the listing and
Yeah.
just sort of go with, just so you know, you will be sharing this house. And most of the time, they're pretty good with things. But every once in a while, it might be a little disconcerting to hear somebody clumping up and down this, hallway upstairs. At this point, I'd say it's probably, I don't know, 60-40. Like 60% of the folks are there because it's a haunted house and it's my haunted house. And then
Yeah.
there's 40% of them who they're there because Oberlin College and the conservatory are there. And it's actually really quite affordable to stay there comparatively. And it's a really charming little house. And it's quiet and it's like a nice, cozy little artist retreat if you're into that sort of thing.
I can just picture people that don't know and on their phones Googling while they're sitting downstairs wondering what's going on.
Well, the room that you showed, the display room, the way the house is set up, like this is sort of an extra. It looks like an addition, although we know that it was built with the original part of the house.
Yeah.
So I keep all of the really excessively weird stuff in there. And unless someone specifically asks for access to the display room, we keep that room shut for folks who stay. And it's, you don't really need to like have access to it to have access to all the rest of the house.
Yeah.
Because I've collected a fair number of haunted things over the years. Nothing that is like tragically, terribly haunted is in there. I mean, I have the cremated remains of a spree killer that someone mailed to me years ago, but she stays at my other house so I can keep her away from people who really don't expect a box like that to have quite so much bite.
Yeah. In terms of yourself, then, when COVID-19 hit, did that affect a lot of your work, and did you have to move online to
Mm.
do things like everyone else, I guess?
Well, open heart surgeries as a kid, I'm really high risk for it. It's not something that I really want to or should catch. So
Yeah, of
it had a
course.
huge, huge impact. I work with Jack Osborne and Katrina Weidman on Portals to Hell and a bunch of other shows. And I mean, the first thing for me, once we weren't on lockdown anymore, I still won't fly. For so many reasons, but mainly just because COVID is airborne, and I can't take the risk.
Yeah.
And in the States, people, even before they dropped mask mandates, were not the most polite to their neighbors, I will say, in the kindest way possible.
I was actually there. I was actually in America a couple of weeks ago for the first time in Dallas, and yeah, there was no there was no such thing there anyway.
Nope, it's the Wild West out here. It
Yeah.
just is. So I've turned down a couple of shows with Jack and Katrina because I just feasibly couldn't get there in a way that felt safe to me.
Yeah.
Uh, which I love working with them. I love the show. Like they let me just put on my blindfold and go, and it's always a great adventure. Uh, but there's been good things from it too. I had a Patreon for many years, and with lockdown and COVID, I moved so many of my classes to online stuff. Like for the longest time, I was like, I don't know if I can teach psychic development like
Mhm.
through a computer because some stuff you just have to be and like you have to be there to feel.
Yeah.
Uh, but like everybody, we adapted. And the Patreon, which is patreon.com/haunted, like I got haunted for
Mhm.
Patreon, has turned into this like thriving community of folks who just like talk with one another, support one another. Like it feels like friends more than anything else. And we just happen to also, share classes and things.
Yeah, and I believe we're going to put this interview on there as well before I bring it out in a couple of weeks. So we've seen this here first anyway on your Patreon.
Yeah, there's a
In
few folks that get to see the sort of like behind the scenes pass of
Yeah.
like how the sausage is made and like what I look like when I'm waiting for an interview and I'm just sitting here with like a bunch of
Vlogging.
little fidgety things.
Vlogging, isn't that what they call it?
Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of yourself then, plans for the future projects,
Mm.
is that are you just kind of waiting to see how this COVID situation pans out, because I'm sure you have a lot of plans, but
Mm.
physically you're probably not able to do everything that you want to right now.
Well, with Inspiration House, we have it open on Airbnb. It just means that I don't go there personally.
Yeah,
There's safe ways to make sure that there's a good space between when people stay there, and all the cleaning protocols. For
yeah,
me, I mean, I'm a writer and I'm a reader, so I'm built for lockdown. I live in a house with about 5,000 books. I do not lack for things to do. I'm always working on something. I just came out with the Keprian Ritual Archives, which is a collection of the ritual work for my magical society that kind of is a retrospective over about 30 years of work. Uh, and I've also been going back to things that I just love. Like a lot of us during lockdown just found things that fed us. Some people
hmm,
took up basket weaving and flower arranging, and I took up ancient incense making and
yeah,
got back to making games, role playing games and things. So, like, I've got an itch.io website and a couple of like journaling games and some other stuff that's in the pipe that's just fun. All paranormal, all spooky, because I can't not be. Uh,
yeah.
but lets me just entertain myself while also sharing something that hopefully entertains other people.
Yeah, and I'll put your website and all the details for your social media and your Patreon at the bottom of this video. And Michelle, it was a pleasure to catch up with you today, and hopefully we can catch up again soon, because you've got a lot of things going
Yeah,
on that we didn't discuss, like the magic and other stuff. So I'd like to catch up with you again at some point.
no, this is fun and fantastic.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for having me.
thank you so much, Michelle. Good night.
Bye. Good night.